Good morning, everyone. I call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 65 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, pursuing to the House Order of June 23rd, 2022. And therefore, members can attend in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Should any technical challenges arise, please advise me immediately. Please note that we may need to suspend a few minutes as we need to ensure that all members are able to participate fully. Pursuant to Standing Order 108.3 and the motion adopted by the committee on Wednesday, December 7th, 2022, the committee resumed its study of foreign interference and threats to the integrity of democratic institutions, intellectual property, and the Canadian state. Madam Clerk, we have done all our technical tests. Yes. Now I would like to welcome our witness for today, Raphael Glucksmann.
Committee on Foreign Interference in all democratic processes in the European Union, including disinformation and the strengthening of integrity, transparency, and accountability in the European Parliament. Monsieur Glucksmann, bienvenue.
Mr. Glucksmann, welcome to the committee, and the floor is now yours for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you to all the honorable members for their invitation. I will speak in French, if you may, for the next 5 minutes. Donc, merci infiniment de votre...
So, thank you very much for your invitation. The committee that I am the chair of started work in 2001. And since then, we have been working on analyzing foreign interference in all democratic processes at the European Parliament. We have worked with over 150 experts. We have worked with whistleblowers, with journalists, with diplomats, and after going through all the confidential and public notes that have been taken, different reports published in the European Union, the work we've done on the ground, we determined that this situation is very serious for the European Parliament. For far too long, our governments have let other hostile foreign states interfere in our affairs. Now, typically, there are two goals in terms of foreign interference. On the one hand, we have governments that interfere in our democratic processes in order to promote their own interests, in order to establish deals that are favorable for them, or in order to put an end to criticism against their own system. So we have political interference. We could speak of Qatar that actually used corruption in the European Parliament to have an effect on the decisions that were made. And then there are actors that have a different goal. The goal in this case is not necessarily to push their interests, but to weaken our democracy. And they are targeting not only our democracy, but the way that we function and our ideals. Now, Russia and China are two key players in this field. So firstly, I will briefly speak of Russia. Russia's goal is to create chaos in our democracy. This is a sort of hybrid war that has been declared against the EU. And right now, we have not truly reacted to this war. And when I talk about a hybrid war, I'm speaking of attacks on hospitals during the pandemic. I know that this has happened in my region, in Paris as well. A hospital was debilitated for weeks because of Russian attacks. And then they also target our social networks using bots and armies of online trolls, as we call them. And the goal here was to spread extremist ideals and to divide our country. And oftentimes we have Russians that will share discourse from two extremely opposing sides simply to create chaos. So then we also have corruption. We looked at how the German energy grid was actually affected by the Russians. And the effect that this had is that people went over to Gazprom. So what's happening here is extremist ideologies are being promoted. They're using think tanks and NGOs that are now questioning European Parliament. The goal here is to destabilize our democracy. The actor that concerned us the most, beside Russia, was China. China is in the first group, meaning that they're trying to promote Chinese ideals. Recently, China has took inspiration from Russian authorities. We've seen that since the pandemic, China has also been working to destabilize us. And they use similar techniques to that of the Russians. But one big difference is that they focus more on economic actors more so than political actors. So, for example, at the European Parliament, the Chinese authorities don't actually have to use lobbies because the Europeans are very involved on an economic level with the Chinese. And so these major European countries have actually been, in a certain way, helping the Chinese. Thank you very much, Mr. Glucksmann, for your opening statement. We do have a lot of questions from members of the committee. We are going to begin with Mr. Gould. Each member has 6 minutes to ask their question. Our first round will begin with Mr. Gould, member of the Conservative Party. You have 6 minutes, Mr. Gould. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to our witness. His opening statement was extremely interesting. And I have a lot of questions on how the European community is dealing with its striking need for energy. You spoke of China and Russia's influence on Europe, aiming to destabilize them. But when we speak of China, for example, these are not democracies, closer to dictatorship. What I'd like to know is, how should our democracies react to these giants that want to destabilize Europe and North America?
Merci beaucoup pour votre question.
Thank you for the question. So what should our reaction be? Firstly, it should be expedient and more severe. Firstly, there's been a lack of sanctions. So once there's an attack on critical infrastructure, once we can see that there has been corruption, there needs to be sanctions. And in the EU, that hasn't been the case. Now, the next important question, Mr. Gould, you spoke of energy. We have to talk about our dependency. Up until now, we have been entirely dependent on Russian energy, and we've realized the extent to which, even in critical sectors, we are dependent on Chinese products. So if we want to strengthen European sovereignty, we have to reduce our dependency on other countries. We can call this de-risking. And this is something we need to focus on. We have specific recommendations on this, as a matter of fact. Canada could contribute to some of this energy supply to Europe to reduce this dependency. Now, in our country, some organizations don't want us to develop energy production in Canada. Could you tell us more about your opinion on exporting energy to Europe from Canada? Now, I don't have much information about Russia and China's impact on Canada specifically, but what I can say is that in Europe, we have seen that there has been a significant impact. In terms of energy, I think it's important to take a look at what happened in Germany. We took a sort of scan of the German government, and we saw that even in higher levels, there were people who had been influenced to move over to Gazprom. So the situation is very serious and should be considered from a long-term perspective for our countries, right? Well, we will always be somewhat dependent on Russian energy. But what we have seen in the EU is that we've diversified our suppliers. And we are also looking at the question of developing renewable energy in Europe, especially the nuclear question. Will renewable energy be able to cover all our needs for energy supply? Right now, we know that that will not be possible. And we can also see that imports are necessary. We will not become entirely independent in terms of energy in the coming years, but we don't want to make the same mistake that we made in previous years, that being entirely dependent on an authoritarian regime for our energy supply. So we don't want to be dependent on a regime that doesn't share our values. We can see that Europe wants to reduce its dependence on fossil fuels. But this will not happen overnight. For how many more years do you think the EU will need fossil fuels? 10, 15 years? I would say more than that in terms of our need, but this requirement is being reduced. It will be a gradual change. We will have less and less of a need, but this will take time. You have 30 seconds, Mr. Gould. The International Commission on Energy Security has shared some interesting information on renewable energy and fossil fuels. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning of the question, Mr. Gould. There's an International Commission on International Energy Security that's working on renewable energy and fossil fuels and the energy transition. Could you speak of this? Yes, I think this would be very interesting to talk about. Now, across all parties in the EU, our priority is the energy and the environmental transition towards net zero. Thank you very much. Now we're going to go on to Mr. Fergus. Mr. Glucksmann, just so that you're aware, I will be naming each individual who will be asking questions. So, Mr. Fergus, go ahead.
Monsieur Glucksmann.
Hello, Mr. Glucksmann, and thank you very much for being here today. It's very much appreciated rather. I can see that you have a lot of expertise. In your opening statement, you talked about China, Russia, and other countries, but especially Russia, who are trying to create chaos in our democracies. Several witnesses have appeared here in committee and have said that Russia and China, especially on social media, have been interfering for a long period of time. Now, having done this work, I would like to know when you think China and Russia began working on this propaganda and influence, this sort of online terrorism on our social networks. Thank you, Mr. Fergus, for the question. We have been looking at 2007 in the case of Estonia and the cyber attacks that happened there. So this was one of the first European countries that moved everything online. And in 2007, Russian hackers worked together to attack their online system. And for a certain period of time, it was almost impossible for them to govern their own country. And in our opinion, that was the beginning of this hybrid war. And then online, there's been an evolution of Russian propaganda. In 2012, 2013, they created the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. And that's when things became very serious and structured and very systematic. So I think those are the two important dates in terms of this hybrid war with Russia. And something that we often struggle to understand when we work in a democratic environment in North America and Europe, it's that it's hard to understand that other countries may have the desire to create chaos. So we need to understand the different campaigns that have occurred. For example, in France, there were Russian actors that were saying that the police were engaging in violent acts. And speaking of France, and at the same time, these same Russian actors were saying that the police should be shooting the crowd that was protesting. So two different views, creating chaos. And I can imagine that in the US, they've tried to create a lot of divide on what is going on there. So we've spoken of Russia. There's a focus on cyber terrorism. But let's move over to the economy. Could you speak more to this topic? And when did China actually begin these cyber attacks on economic organizations? So I think when things really changed with China, first of all, it was a gradual radicalization. So Xi Jinping is really the one that has been developing this strategy, but where we really saw a shift in terms of destabilization online is the pandemic. The pandemic created radicalization. They began promoting this narrative and made things very difficult for us to govern in Europe. So this was the beginning of a new strategy, a strategy that says that globalization will allow major companies in the West to become more Chinese-oriented. So when we look at numbers for sales and production, we can see that these numbers are actually lower in China than in Germany. The problem that I'm trying to raise here is that there is a certain dependency on China. We can look at Volkswagen in the Uyghur region. Volkswagen has an economic interest in leaving the region, except they're kind of held hostage by the Chinese government because of the market over there. So right now, it's become, like I said, a sort of economic hostage situation. It's no longer a company's personal decision. On the topic of critical infrastructure, this strategy uses Chinese investments first. The important dates are 2008, 2009 for us. There was the debt crisis in Europe at that time, in Greece. And so the strategy was to take control of critical infrastructure. Thank you. I'll have many more questions later on.
Monsieur Villemure, vous avez la parole.
Mr. Villemure, you have 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Glucksmann, for your presence here today. In the report, you spoke of different types of interference. Our goal in this committee is to evaluate Chinese interference in terms of the state and its integrity. So you spoke of this in your report. Could you tell us more about this? Thank you very much. Very happy to answer questions with you again. Russia and China's strategies are the same for this. In terms of the state's integrity, we have to look at when they're getting control of our networks. So we can see that China has had an effect on the integrity of our decision-making process, because some people they have had an effect on retirement for public servants and them being paid by Huawei. And then we have the revolving doors concept. What is this? Well, it's the idea that a Canadian company is not the same as a Chinese company under the communist system. When a private company gets big enough in China, it's no longer private. It's more so public. And so they're going to have a CCP representative in the company. This becomes a hostile state actor. The other thing to add on state integrity is the question of the links between institutions. When institutions are working together, we can look at Australia, for example. There's a difference between working with Australia or China. this can have a great effect on our state's integrity. Now, when you speak of institutions, are you talking about universities, for example? Yes, universities, scientific institutions, institutions that work on development. What we've found is that even in research institutions, there has been a sort of trap created with technology and recruitment. Have you found that the Chinese regime has directly or indirectly been funding political activity or anything that surrounds our democratic process? In the case of China, there hasn't necessarily been direct funding of European political movements. Now, that was the case with Russia, who funded the far right in the EU and has actually stated that they did so. Like I said, they did fund the far right that does question the existence of some of our European institutions. Now, there are political actors that have been influenced by China, and there are think tanks and research institutions that do participate in our political life and that are receiving a direct or indirect form of funding from China. As we speak now, would you say that foreign interference is a serious danger to Canadian democracy? Once again, thank you for the question. I'm not an expert on foreign interference in Canada. What's for sure is that this is a serious risk in Europe. It's a critical danger. I hope for you that your democracy is more stable than ours. I hope it's better protected as well. But it is a danger for all democracies. Despite not being an expert in Canada, I can say that. One thing that we have to understand is that for a long time, we've seen that there are regimes that don't even necessarily or may not oppose us in terms of ideology, but that are tangibly hostile to our democracy. And their goal is to weaken us, to attain what Russia and China have called a new world order. And so I think that Canada needs to be aware of these threats. So we're not necessarily equipped to deal with this level of chaos. We first think of everyone's the well-being of the Canadian public, and we don't necessarily think of this destabilization very often. Yes, and that's essential. We need to be able to step into their shoes and their mindset. So we need to read the theories that are the basis of these regimes, and we need to understand that their goal is chaos. Oftentimes, the mistake we make is to think that everyone thinks the same way as us. Are there any documents that you could send us? I would very much appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Villemur. Mr. Villemur is from the Bloc Québécois. Mr. Glucksmann, thank you for your answers. Next, we have Mr. Green from the New Democratic Party. Mr. Green, I think that you will be asking your questions in English.
That's correct.
Interpretation. Okay.
Perfect.
It was a wild guess on my part, man.
Well, John, I got to say your French is coming along quite nicely. I got to comment on that.
Thank you to my French teacher, Annick Robitaille, for that. So, Matthew, you have 6 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you. And thank you very much for being with us today, Mr. Glucksmann. I'm keenly interested in your work in the European Union. And just to put on the record, you are the chair of the Special Committee on Foreign Interference in all democratic processes in the European Union, including disinformation and the strengthening of integrity, transparency, and accountability in the European Parliament. Is that correct?
Yes.
The resolution adopted on March 9th, 2022 states that there's a need for an EU coordinated strategy against foreign interference, which among other things should cover interference through global actors via elite capture. Can you expand on why a strategy against foreign interference should address elite capture?
Yeah, what we have discovered is that a central element of foreign interference is this transformation of our elite, political elites, of course, but also economic elites and cultural elites into a kind of supermarket where you can come with your big companies and actually offer money to get them to work for you. And they come and work for you, be it Gazprom or Huawei, with their networks, their relationship, their knowledge of internal affairs, and it gives incredible influence over your own political decisions.
But we haven't really discovered this, in fact, in the West. The West kind of created this, right, through colonialism. This is a tactic that has been used by the West in other countries for quite some time, and I think that we're seeing it now within our own domestic landscapes is probably what's unsettling for us. Would you not agree that the West has also been involved in these tactics for centuries?
Well, as a French, I can only confirm that colonialism was based on this kind of strategy. But the fact that we...
In the Canadian context, we heard a lot for a very short period of time about the Confucius Institutes. Did that ever come up in your study in terms of the way in which some of our academic institutions might have been co-opted or influenced through foreign-funded think tanks?
Yeah, of course it came along.
And in your studies, did you ever contemplate countries outside of Russia and China, in fact, some which may otherwise be considered allies, engaging in similar types of foreign interference? Was that also part of your accountability and transparency?
Yes, and we have worked on the US, for instance, if that was your question.
Well, I'm curious to know what other countries you may have identified as being active within the context of foreign interference within the European Union.
So basically, we had the mandate to work on any form of interference coming from anywhere. So, of course, we encountered also American interference, be it surveillance or through influence operations. And but what we have done also is to establish a difference between goals that are followed by this program, be it to push for promoting your own interests, which is the case, for instance, I quoted Qatar, or to destabilize our institutions, which is the case of Russia.
Sure. Were there instances of any other countries? So, for instance, there's been anecdotal kind of information domestically in Canada about China, about, India. We talked about the U.S. The notion of, from your perspective, what's the difference between foreign interference and foreign influence? Because I hear this when the West is doing it or when our allies are doing it, it's influence. But when non-aligned actors do it, it's interference. Do you share that analysis, or do you have a different analysis between interference and influence?
Well, I will give you two American examples in history so that you understand what the difference for me between influence and interference. When the Americans worked hard to have a coup in Chile, this was interference, direct interference. Yes, the objective was to destabilize a government, an elected government in Chile, in 1973, I think. When Americans, through the various financing of think tanks, think tanks in France or in Germany, this is influence. The aim is not to destabilize the democratic process. It doesn't go in any way in a covert form, and it does not put at risk our laws.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Did Canada ever come up in any of your studies? Just out of curiosity. Well, that's good to know. A briefing published by the European Parliamentary Research Service states that the EU, the Transparency Register, is the only transparency scheme among OECD nations requiring registered think tanks, research centers, and academic institutions to disclose their funding. Can you describe the purpose of ensuring these organizations disclose their funding, and would you recommend that be implemented in Canada as well?
Well, first, I must say our system is not perfect because it's not always implemented well. But the idea behind it is clearly shown by, I don't know if you heard about the Qatar Gate, because my committee is also mandated to do the follow-up on this. You have NGOs. For instance, we had an NGO called Fight Against Impunity. It looks good on paper, yes. I mean, it's perfect. Everybody is to fight against impunity. And they came and they were really hostile to the United Arab Emirates. Maybe you have good reasons to be hostile to the United Arab Emirates. But the fact is that their funding was coming from Qatar. So if you don't disclose where your money comes from, then, of course, there is a lack of understanding of why you are so much focusing on this or that.
Okay. Thank you, Matt. Merci. Thank you, Mr. Glucksmann. That completes the first round of questioning. We're going to go to our second round. And Mr. Keurig, you're to start the second round for 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to our witness. I very much value the testimony you've provided, and I'd like to follow up with some of the questions that Monsieur Gord asked about energy in particular, because certainly over the course of what has been a tumultuous couple years in energy, and I follow closely coming from an energy producing part of our country. So I found it very interesting how you talked about Europe's experience and the interference specifically related with Russian energy. He mentioned Gazprom and whatnot, and certainly Canada's experience is different because we're not importing at least raw energy. There are refined products that do come to Canada. So I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on that, and specifically the impact that sort of interference, that sort of nefarious influence has on destabilizing regimes, especially at a time when you have not only the dynamics associated with the geopolitical sphere, but also a conflict that is ongoing.
Well, it's a common line to say that you can do wars for pipelines. Actually, Putin did war through pipelines. So pipes were a tool in its hybrid warfare against European democracies. And the strategy on Nord Stream, for instance, if I explain to you, and it's connected to elite capture, Gerhard Schröder is the chancellor of democratic Germany, and 5 to 10 days before he is going to lose the election, it was in 2005, he signs the Nord Stream project with Putin. A few weeks after, he goes to work, after his defeat, because it was a planned defeat and everybody knew he would lose, he goes to work for Gazprom. The result of that is that European dependence on Russian gas only grew until February 24th, 2022. And when the war started, not only we discovered that Germany had built this Nord Stream 1 and 2, but that they also sold their stocks in Germany to Gazprom, and that Gazprom emptied these stocks, these reserves. And as a result, we could not have an embargo on fossil imports from Russia. And European Union financed, during the first 6 months of the war, finance the Russian regime 800 million euros per day.
Wow.
Because of this policy.
Thank you for that, and it's certainly helpful in the larger context. But I want to bring it back to where Canada fits in this. You know, as an ally with Europe, as a democratic nation, you know, I've certainly been frustrated with some of the activism that has taken place that has restricted Canada's ability to be a reliable partner in terms of supplying energy. I'm wondering if, in your experience, you've seen how the efforts of hostile foreign states has not only encouraged and manipulated the geopolitics around imports and exports, but also keeping that dependence from being removed with allies like Canada could be to Europe.
Yeah, I see your point, but we didn't come across this, and we looked for it, by the way, to check, and we didn't see any proofs that you had Russian hands, for instance, behind movements or doubts about Canadian exports.
Okay, and specifically, the beginning of my round, we've talked about Russia. I'm wondering if you could maybe expand and discuss China in the last 30 seconds or so, if there's parallels to the influence that China is exerting, and specifically the communist regime there.
Yeah, I mean, China really plays according to Russian textbooks. And when people are doubting whether there is an alliance between China and Russia, they should just look at the facts. And China is actually implementing the same strategies, except that it's not energy dependency, it's full-scale dependency. And even when we are doing the Green Deal, which we are right to do in the European Union, we vote a lot of subvention, but these are direct subventions to the Chinese production apparatus, because who is building our solar panels, for instance?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Keurig. Mr. Glucksmann again. We're going to go to Mr. Baines, who is next for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to Mr. Glucksmann for joining us today and sharing what's happening in the European Union and the complexities around influence and interference and the differences. We know that Russia has been for decades a major player when it comes to foreign interference, and you've been an advisor to former president of Georgia, Mikhail Saakashvili. What can we learn from Georgia when it comes to Russia's foreign interference actions?
Thank you, and thank you for mentioning Saakashvili's name, because right now, as we speak, he is in prison, held by Russian puppets, which is a Georgian oligarch, Bidzina Ivanishvili. And that's the first way Russia is interfering, money. This is a direct way of interference. But then you have others. Of course, in case of Georgia, you had the military invasion and the dismembering of the nation, 20% occupied territories. But also, you had manipulation of information and campaigns. For instance, in Georgia, the LGBTI rights were never so much an issue in the political debate, yes? And suddenly, you had movements against gay prides, movements all across the countries that were saying that it was a direct threat to Georgian identity, that Saakashvili was in charge and was a pro-Western leader, was inserting decadence in the country, but thousands and thousands of people. And then when we analyze where it came from, it was Russian finance operation.
But then I'm going to go into the, so we've heard a lot about the misinformation, disinformation. I think it's the largest threat to democracy today, the way it's being used to attack. And you've talked about how Russia had the Internet Research Agency. You know, what did the EU do to counter that?
Yeah, and it's very hard actually to fight it without crossing over the line of freedom of speech, because if you think that the Earth is flat it's not my problem as a legislator. But if a foreign government launches campaigns so that millions of my fellow citizens believe that the earth is flat, then it becomes a problem for me. So what we have to act upon is not the fact that people will share weird opinions, but it's to cut this from foreign actors using it and putting money in it. So what we have done is first to impose regulation on platforms, and that's the key. I'm often critical about the European Union, but one piece of legislation that I'm very proud of is the Digital Services Act on platforms.
Last year in Ottawa, we had an illegal occupation of demonstrators, and according to the National Observer, Russia's state-controlled broadcaster, RT, spread disinformation through proxy sites and on social media messaging apps like Telegram, which was widely used by the convoy's genuine grassroots supporters. So how, in your view, do we as democracies counter these efforts to spread and warp the public perception? So I think in your answer you sort of mentioned how it's just pouring money into a certain message to distract in a way and create some type of movement. So how can we counter that?
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning of your question, but one thing is, first, I don't know the status in Canada, but Russia today in Europe is under sanction, and also all their bank accounts are frozen, and they cannot operate anymore. But what we have seen is that actually it doesn't prevent at all Russian propaganda from being shared. And so what we need to do is to identify the networks and sanction them, but very quickly. And at the same time, use existing examples of coherent and victorious fights against disinformation and manipulation of information. And I was very proud to chair the first ever official delegation of European Parliament to Taipei. And I encourage you to work with Taiwanese authorities and to learn from them how they do to keep a democracy growing while being under permanent attack of Chinese Communist Party.
Thank you.
Okay, merci, Monsieur Baines.
Thank you, Mr. Baines and Mr. Glucksmann. Mr. Villemur, you have 2.5 minutes for your questions, please. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'll try to do as much as possible in this 2.5 minutes. Mr. Glucksmann, I'd like to know if you've noticed or whether the event of AI has had an effect on the scope of foreign interference. Not entirely yet, but I know that it's coming quickly. I was at NATO in Riga, and I was able to learn that AI will be the problem of tomorrow. Could you tell us a bit more about what you saw? So it's the ability to build extremely complex campaigns in 2 minutes without having to pay for a single employee. I've seen what that can create. And right now I'm very concerned with how we are going to prepare ourselves for this very destructive technology, that being AI. Do you think that our committee should visit the NATO center that worked on AI in Riga? Yes, I think it would be a great idea. What do you think would help us to better understand foreign interference? I hear us speaking of chaos, those pushing ideologies that are not our own. So what could we do to better understand this concept that is foreign to us? So it might be a complicated advice, but I think you need to read Stiepsky, and which can give you some very useful advice. I think you need to be speaking with experts in AI and also reading Dostoevsky, and that will help you to better understand these regimes and how they think. Thank you very much. Very useful. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Villemure. Next, Mr. Green for 2.5 minutes.
Green.
Thank you. And I'm still very keenly interested in the transparency register, although I wasn't quite clear on the end of my last intervention. Sir, do you recommend that Canada also look at implementing a transparency register?
Well, I mean, it's not up to me to decide whatever you as a sovereign country.
Well, it's not foreign interference.
I do believe
we need recommendations from this committee. So,
but I do believe that transparency registers are helpful for democracies, yes, and especially for parliamentary democracies.
Thank you. The EU Transparency Register is also one of the few registers that require registrants to disclose information about indirect lobbying strategies. Can you describe what this looks like in practice?
Well, actually, I am now working on the fact that it's not very efficient. So I will send you, if you want, the result of our discussion, because it's right now. And we are working on reshaping it and making it clearer and more efficient. But I'm very happy that to share.
That would be helpful
of our discussion. But of course, not as a recommendation from our side, just as information.
No, we need a recommendation of this committee in order to have it included in the findings. So I could say what I'd like, but coming from a witness is much better. The resolution adopted on March 9th, 2022 considers that engagement-based and addictive ranking systems pose a systemic threat to our society. End quote. In regards to foreign influence using online platforms, can you expand on this?
Sorry, I could not hear.
It's a resolution on March 9th from the EU considers that engagement-based and addictive ranking systems pose a systemic threat to our society in regards to foreign interference using online platforms. Presumably, you're talking about algorithms. Can you expand on this?
Yes, what we found out, discussing also with scientists, is that the way the algorithms are structured are actually helping the promotion of addictive opinions, which means those who are, for instance, the most radical or extreme. I'm explaining myself. For instance, when you took the emoticon of Facebook and the anger had 5 times more importance in the algorithm than the like one, then it's an encouragement for this kind of polarization. And the fact we have to think one thing today is that our agora, our public agora, as we speak, is a private property. And it should give all of us vertigo just to think about that. And that's why I wanted to mention before the Digital Services Act that the European Union had the courage to take against lobbying, I must say, from the platforms. And it's to say that you need public scrutiny because it has public impact.
That's important.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Green. Thank you, Mr. Glucksmann. Mr. Glucksmann, I have to ask you a question. There's a desire on the part of the committee to keep you around a little bit longer, probably for about 20 minutes. Because they are finding your testimony extremely compelling. So is it okay if we ask you to stay for an extra 20 minutes? Have you got the time, sir?
Yeah. Okay. Yes, no problem.
Okay. And we're all good with that. We're going to go to the next round. Mr. Barrett is from the Conservative Party. He's got 5 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Barrett.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you, sir, for joining us today. Appreciate your perspectives. I'm wondering if you can tell us about the events that led to the creation of the special committee. I think I'm most interested in the whistleblower protections that are that were part of the plan that was proposed, and I wonder if you could also speak to the nonpartisan nature in which it was approached. So my reading of English language media reports of some of the events of late last year in the context of Canadian politics, it would have placed someone in a similar position in Canada in a difficult political position to have proposed and championed the types of reforms that you're speaking about today, when people who were, if I'm understanding correctly, ideologically aligned or more aligned with you were at the center of some of these scandals, but that I've read have led to the creation of these reforms. But you persisted, and in fact, maybe in spite of that, or maybe because of that, my reading is that you pushed quite hard for these reforms. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much for your question. I think it's an important one. At first, the committee was set much before the Qatar Gate and the scandal. The committee, I pushed for the creation of the committee, and it was especially after Brexit that I thought that we need to set up this kind of committee. And so we worked for 2 years and a half, and we were supposed to finish our work. And then came the Qatar Gate. And I must say, I pushed very hard, despite the fact that it were people, you're right, connected to social democrats that were involved. Because I do believe that first we worked in our committee in a transpartisan manner from the very start, because the protection of democracy is above political partisan differences. It's actually the protection of the framework that allows us to disagree between each other. And second, because I think that it's our duty to fight corruption, to fight foreign interference, including in our own respective political families or groups. And I think I was pushed to go on with the leadership on the committee, because everybody, including from other political groups, trusted that I will go after reforms and also truth, not having any form of consideration for which is the flag of the people who are actually betraying democracy.
With respect to Qatargate, did the charges that the MEPs in question furthered the interests of a foreign state? Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, it goes even beyond that. It's also the charges are also about organization criminal organization.
And what led to the suspicions of these individuals and their activities? Was it the existing framework? I think my review of some of the reporting on it was that that some of their activities weren't particularly sophisticated, but they remained undetected for some time. What led to their detection and charges and arrests and prosecutions?
First of all, it was the investigation of Belgian secret services. They followed the action of one man, Mr. Panzeri, who was a former MEP, and then it led to discover the connection with existing MEPs and also trade unions and NGO people. So it was a secret service organization. Actually, this was not us discovering that.
Okay, well, thanks very much for your response. I'm out of time, so I do appreciate you sticking around for a few more questions. Thanks.
Well, we'll get another chance. We'll get another chance. Ms. Hepner, you have 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank our witness in French, but I'm more comfortable in English. I'm working on it, but I think I will speak in English for now.
I'm a former journalist, I'll let you know. And so it's been really frustrating for me to see the amount of misleading information out there in the world at the same time that we see a decline in the number of newsrooms. And in particular, lately, something that stood out for me is on the American social media platform, Twitter. We've seen news organizations like the NPR in the US, the BBC, and here in Canada, the CBC Radio Canada. They're being labeled as state-funded or government-funded media. And coincidentally, this is happening at the same time that Russian news outlets and government accounts are being allowed back onto that platform. And I have this article that was published this morning in the Kingston Whig Standard. It's titled, "Russia Uses Twitter to Attack Democracy." And in it, there's quoted a former conservative cabinet minister and a Canadian diplomat and expert in Russia. And he says that this labeling of public broadcasters is outrageous. He says it implies that these outlets are under government control in the way that, say, Russian television is. And I'm wondering if you agree with this characterization. What do you think of this labeling of public broadcasters and media outlets?
Well, thank you very much for your question, Madam Hefner. I have to say that Twitter recently becomes more and more worrying for us. Mr. Musk is somebody who plays with rules and has an agenda. And our problem is not that Mr. Musk has an agenda, is that we should take care that this agenda doesn't conflict with our national security and the decency of our public debate. And about your question, well, this is typical error made by European leadership for so long. There is a huge difference between your public radio, our public radio, and Russia Today. And not seeing that finding the same characterization for all of this as media or state-sponsored media or whatever, this is actually erasing the truth about Russia Today. Russia Today is a propaganda tool. It's not a media. And NPR, for instance, or BBC, these are media. You can disagree with their news, but they have a deontology, they have a board, they have an independence, and they are not the same, under the same label. So
Thank you. And in Europe, in fact, I think that you have decided that foreign interference tactics can take many forms, including disinformation, including the suppression of information, the manipulation of social media platforms, threats against and the harassment of journalists, researchers, politicians. So would you say that this labeling of actual media could be considered foreign interference?
I'm not sure. I will label it as foreign interference. I will label it as useful idiocy, maybe. Enabling foreign interference.
Fair. So if a Canadian politician actively requested that an American billionaire label a Canadian news organization as government funded, what would you say about that?
Well, I mean, I don't want to enter into the Canadian debate. I'm not aware about this, but I would just repeat what I have said, which is that our public radios and TVs are medias. Russia Today is a propaganda tool engaged in a war. So not seeing the difference between both is really problematic.
Thank you. My ears perked up, I have to say, when you said one of the best things that your parliament had done is impose regulations on platforms. And I have to tell you that we're doing similar things here in Canada with a couple of pieces of legislation I've been lucky to work on as in my work in another committee in Heritage. Do you think that
Okay, Ms. Hefner,
am I out of time?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll come back.
I'm sorry about that. That completes this round, and we appreciate the fact, Mr. Glucksmann, that you are going to stick around. We'll have 2 5-minute rounds, one from the Conservative and the Liberals, and then 2.5 minutes each for the Bloc Québécois and the NDP. On va commencer avec Monsieur.
We'll begin with Mr. Gould. 5 minutes, Mr. Gould. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd really like to underline the expertise that we have with our witness today. It's very much appreciated. Foreign influence in our democracies has a goal, and I think it's interesting to see all the geopolitics that surround this influence and why it's important for Russia and China. You spoke in your presentation, your opening statement, about the fact that their main goal is to increase energy costs, to sell more? There must be some goal that we should be aware of. There was an article in from a Russian media that we read in our research. And it stated, it was speaking of Gazprom, this is not only about money. It's not just about increasing prices or increasing consumption. It's about creating dependency because it's a geopolitical or ideological, political goal. It's not just business. And they were actually ready to sacrifice their own interests to make other countries more dependent on them, even if they lose money. Now, with the war in Russia, the Russians are losing not only money, but their young people. Do you think this war is in the same vein, the same goal? From the beginning, Putin's regime is in a war against the West, not any specific country. It's the West. And so they're ready to have to suffer some losses for that. Now, here in Canada, we've seen the effects of energy price increases, but we haven't really felt the direct effects of the war in other ways. But do you think that things could get worse and that this could have a greater effect on Canada? I think that for the time being, in terms of real tangible military war, this risk is limited right now because Russia has been shocked at how well Ukraine has fought back. They thought that Ukraine would fall quickly, but they didn't. And so Ukraine is protecting us in Europe and protecting you in North America for the time being. Ukrainians are losing their lives for their country, but for all of us to protect our democracies. In our last elections in Canada, we've spoken a lot about Chinese interference. What would you advise us? Do you think that we should be highly concerned with this interference in upcoming elections? As legislators, our goal here and our duty is to make sure that we're working in secure conditions. And so we want to protect our democracies from interference. And this interference can happen in different ways, and it evolves over time. So it's very important, the work that you're doing. And as Canadian legislators, we need to raise our voices against what has happened in our last 2 elections. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning of your question. Do we need, as MPs, to speak up loudly against Chinese interference and push for more transparency? Without transparency, it's not a democracy. I can't tell you which type of attitude you should have, though, to protect your own democracy. Thank you very much for your help today. I very much appreciated it. I can see just how much experience you have, and you you've shared valuable information. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Gould. We're going to go to Mr. Fergus for 5 minutes. But I'm going to give Mr. Villemur another 2.5 minutes, so that will be 5 minutes in total. And then Mr. Green, is that okay, Mr. Glucksmann? 15 more minutes? Yes. I'll be late to my next meeting, but this is more important. Okay, thank you very much.
Timelines too.
J'apprécie votre.
Thank you for your generosity, Mr. Glucksmann. Mr. Glucksmann, I did a little bit of research on the EU's European Parliament's procedure. And you have classified documents. It seems that, well, could you speak to us about the protocols that your committee has when you're looking at classified documents? So we have different types of meetings. We have public meetings, we have in-camera meetings, and then meetings that require special authorization to access classified information. And so there are these 3 levels, and therefore the entirety of our work is not public, of course. And we have also done work studying the European Parliament itself, and we've had in-camera meetings with Russian actors in our Defense Committee. But there were no rules that prevented us from doing this work. As I listened to you, I thought of the fact that we have a committee here that works on national intelligence. And they are allowed to look at highly secret documents, though there are limits on the extent to which they can reveal this information. They have a top secret report and a public report. Do you think that that's the best way or a good way to go about things? Is that similar to the way you guys work in terms of accessing confidential documents? Are there some things that you can share and some things that you cannot? Yes, of course, there are certain documents that we are able to access and some that cannot be made public. The problem that we have, as you may know, is that we're speaking of 27 states that make up the European Union. And security clearance is not always done at the EU level. And so I'm not sure that we could be an example for you given our specific situation. And I also have to add that our institutions are still quite young, which is positive and negative at the same time. Wow, so for once we're actually ahead of you. So I have a minute and a half left. Mr. Glucksmann, here's what I'd like to know. In order to really understand what China, Russia, Iran, all these countries that want to create chaos in our countries, in our democracies, do you think that we should have a committee that can oversee everything and a committee that will go beyond in camera? Should there be a parliamentary committee like we have in Canada to look at these top secret documents? Honestly, I would say yes. I've actually been frustrated in the European Parliament at times when I've spoken with colleagues at the Senate in the United States. I've seen that they are able to do investigations and we don't have this ability. That's something that I think is wonderful to have. Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Mr. Villemur, the floor is yours for 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I feel much better to have 5 minutes instead of 2.5. Mr. Glucksmann, I'd like to know, in your study, have you seen attempts to destabilize intelligence services by foreign states, of course? We have seen issues with this, but we don't have access to information that is classified enough to know if there have been these attempts. Okay, have you seen attempts to destabilize journalists, specific journalists? Yes. Yes, very honestly, I would say in many cases, actually. Could you tell us more about the effects of this without giving us classified information? But what are the effects of this type of maneuver? Well, there are journalists that are employed by the Chinese regime, the Russian regime, and then there are also companies that support and actually give information to journalists that is false information. There was a scandal with a TV channel in France, actually. So journalists are a target. So to summarize what you've said, the parliament has its role to play. For example, we need to be able to potentially establish a registry through an independent organization that would allow us to track things. And this needs to be independent from the government. Is that what you were trying to say? Yes, and as I speak to you right now, we are actually working on reforming our rules. Our committee is trying to find very quickly a compromise on our transparency registry, and we're working on conflicts of interest as well. In your report, you spoke of the fact that certain political parties have been concerned about foreign funding. Could you tell me more about that? So when we speak of foreign entities, we're talking about countries outside of the EU. So we've seen a case of this. It happened earlier than we were aware of, but this is something that happens very frequently, and in this case, it was Russia. So I'm going to leave the last couple minutes for you to share with us what you think we should do. What steps should we take? I think that regulating platforms is critical. They need to be held accountable. When a media outlet shares information, they're responsible for that information. That's the first thing in terms of content. And then next, I think what is essential is to understand the importance of the media, of NGOs in a democratic environment, and to go beyond the simple concept of a market and to allow these associations to receive support. And it's important to understand that we have opponents to our democracy. And any weakness is seen as an invitation for aggression. So we need sanctions. So if we look at Qatargate, there were sanctions for those who had been corrupted. But what are the sanctions for the regime in Qatar? Well, none. Yes, it's very interesting because Qatar was a unique case. Would it be possible to send more information on that which you've spoken of to the committee? Yeah, we will send the results of our current negotiations as well. And that will include recommendations on changes. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Glucksmann. Mr. Villemur. The last questions are for Mr. Green. 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Glucksmann, I think you can see that your popularity at this committee, I think, warrants our reflection on what we can do in an ongoing way. And I note that as the chair of the special committee, the European Union has endeavored to keep up with the evolving nature of the threat. So, and I know you've been reluctant to make recommendations, but that is how our committee works. So we don't, we've invited you here and we would ask for your candor. So I'll ask you, what kind of recommendations can your special committee make to the EU and the European Parliament?
Well, I'm perfectly happy to make recommendations to the EU and to the European Parliament, but I was just shy about making a recommendation to you because I don't know the Canadian situation well enough.
So what kind of recommendations can you make through your special committee to the EU?
Well, the recommendation that first we have to protect general interests from foreign interference, but now we are also dealing with private interest interference in our committee. And for instance, the discussion now, the hottest discussion in our committee is about conflict of interest of elected members. And this is a key debate that we are having. And what we have to keep in mind is that the struggle against corruption is not only a question of moral or ethics. It's a question of strength or weakness of our institutions. And, you know, I'm not a moralist. I'm not even a novelist. I'm an elected politician, so I don't care about anybody's soul, private soul. I care about the fate of nations, yes, of systems. And corruption is a danger for the survival of democracy. And it's a tool used by foreign powers to weaken and make subservient our nations. So that's the thing that we are working on as we speak in the European Parliament. And the second thing is to reassert the notion of public scrutiny, both in the question of platforms, but also in the question of how value chains of biggest European companies are being used by Chinese regime as we speak to weaken us on strategic issues. And this is something key, and that's why we also work with our friends from.
I'm gonna have to proceed through my line of questioning. My apologies. So I'll just put it to you straight. Do you think a similar committee could be worthwhile here in Canada? Just simple yes or no. It's okay if you feel uncomfortable.
I feel uncomfortable.
Well, I'm worried about the fate of the nation.
No, I encourage every single democratic institutions to have this kind of committee.
Okay, thank you. And do you believe that every democratic state should have a foreign agent registry?
I think it will be wise, but we don't have it in Europe yet.
Are you considering it?
We are discussing it with the Commission.
So how does your special committee plan to implement to the European Union a coordinated strategy against foreign interference as recommended by the resolution adopted on March 9th, which calls for that?
We have worked with the European Commission on the package that will be out at the end of the spring called Defense of Democracy package, and I think that will be the approach.
Out of the many resolutions recommendations, which do you consider to be the most urgent?
Well, all of them, but the main one will be I can't respond. Sorry, you got me on this one.
That's okay.
I don't have one.
Well, so I'll put this, in my remaining 30 seconds to you for your consideration for future correspondence back to this committee. I agree that our democracies are very fragile. I agree that they are under threat from hostile actors internationally, both those that are explicit and, quite frankly, from some of our allies. I would also agree that our parliament needs to deeply consider whether it's through this ethics committee or I think actually in this moment, a special committee for this particular purpose would be warranted to keep up with just the absolute velocity of tools used by foreign hostile actors against Canada and against our democracies and democratic institutions. So in your consideration of all those things, when you report back to our committee, I'm going to ask you to be candid. I'm going to ask you to think in the framework of an elected official defending the fate of a nation and give us whatever candid recommendations you see fit. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
And I have your response. Because we need you on that. I think that if you can work with us on the equivalent of a Digital Services Act, that will be very helpful, which means responsibility for platform.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Green. Merci, Monsieur Glucksmann.
Thank you, Mr. Glucksmann. That was our last question for the day. And on behalf of our committee and all Canadians, thank you for speaking with us today.
Gracious with your time. The interest in the committee and hearing what you had to say obviously extended the time that you were expected to be here. And for that, I say thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Okay. So I'm going to suspend for about a minute or so. Just to make sure that Mr. Glucksmann is gone. And then we're going to return just 1 second. We're going to return in public. I don't really see the need of being in camera, so because I've got an update for the committee on some committee business. So let's suspend for just 1 minute, please. Just a reminder to the committee members, we're dealing with committee business. We're in public. I wanted to just bring the committee up to date on where we are in terms of the schedule. First and foremost, we've lost a couple of days, May 5th and the 19th, as a result of the motion that was passed. I see your hand. I also got Mr. Barrett first and then you second, Mr. Villemure. So we lost a couple of days based on the motion that was passed in the Commons yesterday on unanimous consent. So for Tuesday, we've got the final 2 witnesses, Madam Clerk, are coming in, 2, on the access to information.
2 witnesses for the first hour,
and
the departments for the second hour.
And the departments for the second hour. And then we are going to leave time for drafting instructions on Tuesday. We've gone full circle on that study, and I think there's enough, not just based on the interim report that we've received, but also subsequent having the minister in, et cetera, for enough for the analysts to finalize that report and make recommendations to Parliament and the government. The second thing is on Friday. As you recall, the committee passed a motion on Tuesday on the appointment of the Ethics Commissioner. So my plan is to call the witnesses for next Friday. This will push off the foreign interference study for a bit. And that's the update that I have. But Mr. Barrett, I saw your hand. Go ahead, please.
Yeah,
and then
thanks.
Mr. Villemure.
Yep, thanks, Chair. So I appreciate the update on the schedule. I'm not sure how much time we'll have to get through all of that. I'm going to put forward a motion here, but I think that some discussions between parties with respect to meetings beyond next Friday, with respect to Tuesday's motion, that if we don't have time on the clock today, that we can have some conversations about that. So I think that the schedule as proposed is and that plan is good, but with having lost a couple of upcoming meetings, that we can discuss that amongst the parties.
I see your hand, Mr. Fergus. Just a reminder for committee, we have 14 meetings after this one.
Okay.
Because of the 2 that we've lost. So go ahead.
Okay. So with respect to the study on foreign interference, I move that in relation to the committee study of foreign interference and threats to the integrity of democratic institutions, intellectual property in the Canadian state, the committee A, invite Alexandre Trudeau, founder and succession member of the Trudeau Foundation, and B, summons Pascal Fournier and Maurice Rosenberg, both former president and CEO of the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, to appear at a date no later than May 5th. And I believe my staff gave paper copies in both official languages for distribution. And if the motion is in order, I just have a few comments to make about it, Chair.
Okay. Madam Clerk, have this been distributed to members?
I did.
Okay, thank you. So the motion is in order. Okay. So, Mr. Barrett, you have a few comments on it? Please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Chair. So with respect to item B, Pascal Fournier and Maurice Rosenberg were included on the witness list submitted by Conservatives, and I have not received an indication that there has been acceptance, but my understanding is that they haven't acknowledged receipt, which is an indication that there's not an intention to appear, and that's the rationale why. That's the rationale for a summons.
If I can intervene for a second, the reason why we had the gap in the second hour is that there were invitations that were sent out. Unfortunately, we couldn't fill the spots for various reasons. So I just want to make that clear, and that allowed us to have Mr. Glucksman speak for a little bit extra. But I just wanted to, for the benefit of the committee, I wanted to make that clear. So go ahead.
And the final point with respect to item A, Mr. Trudeau, the rationale is for that invitation, not a summons, an invitation to Mr. Trudeau, is that it's widely reported the gift of $140,000 to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, that is the subject of reporting that reflects that this was an influence operation by the communist regime in Beijing, which has since seen the foundation rightly return that donation to the donor. But the individual in question, Mr. Trudeau, was the signatory as part of that transaction, and so relevant to our study on foreign interference.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Barrett. On the motion, I have Mr. Villemure, Mr. Fergus, and Mr. Green. So go ahead, Mr. Villemure.
C'était pas sur la motion, c'est un autre point précédent.
It's actually on a different point, not the motion. Not talking about the motion. Mr. Fergus?
Avec M. Villemure, c'était sur ce que vous...
It was like Mr. Villemure on something you said earlier.
Am I up?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, I'm certainly happy to consider all the impacts of foreign interference. I will note that this this trend of bringing in the family members, I get the political capital that's gained from it, but I feel like to use this committee in that way, if we have other witnesses, the allegations that are being levied, if they're true, I think would warrant a full-scale investigation by the appropriate authorities. But as it relates to this committee, I'm not super comfortable with it, given where we're at and the work that we have to do. I'm uncomfortable with going down this line, and I'll share with you. I'm going to share with my Conservative colleagues a growing trend of trying to shop these things around different committees and try to find some place where it sticks. It's starting to feel like spaghetti against the wall, and if you have a smoking gun, I encourage you to put it on the table, let people know exactly and specifically what it is you're talking about. But the comments made by my friend, Mr. Barrett, don't suffice, at least in my opinion, to kind of go down that path with the family members, given the kind of precedents that have been set around the House. If that's what it's going to be, then I would need to have something more substantive to go on than a feeling of that. So that's just where I'm at right now, and I'm happy to hear more rationale from the Conservative colleagues why they want to go in that direction. But until then, I'm just registering my uneasiness with it.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Green, Mr. Fergus, and then Ms. Hepner after that. Go ahead.
On the motion, moi je suis d'accord avec monsieur.
On the motion, I'm in agreement with Mr. Green. What we did this morning was extremely important. I think this revealed a lot about what the European Union is doing. It's an important file. I don't necessarily like what we're doing right now, but I guess we're going to vote and see where we go with this, but I'm not in favor whatsoever with this motion. Thank you, Mr. Fergus. Ms. Hepner?
Thank you, Chair. I also want to say I appreciate Mr. Green's comments, and I agree as well. I'm concerned by this constant coming back to these sorts of gotcha moments. And I think that this committee can do really, really good work. And I think that we have studies coming up that we've proposed that we haven't been able to get to. And I'm particularly interested in the TikTok study. I would think that we should get to that as soon as possible. We've seen states and whole jurisdiction that are taking immediate action against this platform, and we haven't even been able to get to a study to it. So I'll leave it at that, but just to say I really wish we could get back to some of the really important work this committee does, like what we saw this morning.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Hepner. Mr. Green, your hand's still up. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just, again, I'm kind of, admittedly, I was caught a little bit off guard by the motion and didn't have the chance to consult with folks in advance of this. But I would say this, that look, I am open. I'm certainly, open to the former board members, people, the non-family related people testifying, and if there is in the course of that testimony evidence that indicates Mr. Trudeau in a deeper way that would require a second consideration of this, I would at that point be willing to support it. So I guess through you, Mr. Chair, to the mover of the motion, if he's still present, or anybody who's willing to speak on his behalf, would they be willing to, in this moment, allow the motion to come with the first two that were listed and set aside Mr. Alexandre Trudeau until such time as the initial testimony would perhaps further involve him in the necessity of this study?
Okay, so I'm going to ask, I don't see the, Mr. Green, just for your benefit, I know you're not here, you're on Zoom. Mr. Barrett has left, presumably for question period. There was a question directly to one of the members of the Conservative Party, so if anybody's able to answer that. And I think, just to reiterate, Mr. Green's question is related to Ms. Fournier and Mr. Rosenberg, correct, Mr. Green?
Correct, and I'll state that if they're not prepared to answer that, then I would advise them that they may want to let this motion sit for the time being and revisit at a later date. It's unlikely it would pass today.
Okay, so I see Mr. Courick's hand up. Go ahead, Mr. Courick.
Thanks very much, Chair. And I would just note that the motion does, it's very distinct in terms of point A. It does invite Mr. Trudeau, but then in part B, it does summon. So there's a pretty big difference in the approach, and I think that it addresses an aspect of what Mr. Green is what his concerns are. Because the part B is certainly a more direct and stronger push to ensure that those who are involved in this are who have not at this point responded to the committee's overture, and at this point not certainly if Mr. Trudeau was interested in coming to the committee, he would be able to respond to an invite, but there's a pretty big difference in that. So I'd just be curious if that addresses aspects of some of the concern that Mr. Green has.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Courick. I see Mr. Green's hand up, and then Mr. Villemure.
As I had mentioned to my friends on the Conservative side, if they would set that aside and allow for the Part B to happen, then I would suggest that if in the course of the investigation on Part B, the study on Part B with Pascal Fournier and Mr. Rosenberg, if it was deemed at that time appropriate to send that invitation to Mr. Trudeau, then I'm for that. But I would also recognize the nature in which being implicated in this type of thing has almost as much effect as being brought before the committee, and that's why I would like to give the presumption of innocence, given his relationship to the Prime Minister, until such time as we have real information that would implicate him in a more serious way. So again, I would restate that if the movers of the motion would be open to setting aside A until after B happens, then I would be willing to revisit that. If that's not the case, then I'm not really interested in getting into the into Part A in this particular case.
Okay, thank you for that, Mr. Green. Mr. Villemure, I saw your hand up. Okay, Mr. Gould, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Gould. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Green stated something very interesting. The Conservative Party may accept to keep Part B and then to remove Part A. We could do Part A in another motion. That would be a potential arrangement that we would accept. Thank you, Mr. Gould. I think that what Mr. Green shared was not for sending another motion with Mr. Trudeau. I think what Mr. Green said is actually about
and just proceeding to Part B. I don't want to put any words in Mr. Green's mouth. I see his hands up. Mr. Green?
Yeah, look, I'm sharing with you that I am open to, with due cause, which I don't have presented in this very short period of time we've spoken, to revisiting A. What I'm not interested in is this motion being split up and then not having the evidence, in my opinion, substantive enough to support A, as used as some like got you. So I would suggest that if the Conservative side would be willing to set A aside until after we do B, then I think that the testimony of the two people referenced in B would give me adequate information to determine whether or not I would support bringing Alexander Trudeau here or not.
Okay, thank you.
Just to be 100%.
Thank you, Mr. Green. So the challenge we have right now is that the motion is on the floor. We would need an amendment to eliminate A, and then go back. We would require either unanimous consent or a vote on the amendment, and then go back to the main motion with A being eliminated. Monsieur Villemure, go ahead.
Je désire proposer un amendement qui...
I'd like to table an amendment to remove point A.
Okay, so the amendment's on the floor. It's in order. Any discussion on that? Do we have unanimous consent to remove A? We don't? Okay, let's go to a vote, please. Mr. Keurig, I see your hand up. Was it, I assume it wasn't on the amendment because it was up earlier? Okay, thank you. Vote, please, to remove Part A of the motion.
Le vote sur l'amendement proposé par M. Villemure.
Vote on Mr. Villemure's amendment.
No.
M. Fergus.
No.
Ms. Hefner.
No.
Ms. Koutrakis. No. Monsieur Lauzon.
No.
Mr. Davidson.
Yay.
Monsieur Gourde.
Oui.
Mr. Keurig.
Support.
Support. Monsieur Villemure.
En faveur.
Mr. Green.
En faveur.
Mr. Chair, yeas 5, oui 5, nays 5, contre 5.
Okay, so I vote in favor of that.
In favor.
So the amendment carries to remove Part A. We're back to the main motion minus A. Any further discussion on this? Seeing no further discussion, no hands on Zoom. Madam Clerk, I'm going to call the vote, please, on the motion as amended.
Vote is on the motion as amended. Mr. Baines.
I vote no.
Nope. Monsieur Fergus.
No.
Ms. Hefner.
No.
Ms. Koutrakis.
No.
Monsieur Lauzon.
No.
Mr. Davidson.
Yes.
Monsieur Gourde.
Pour.
Mr. Keurig.
I support.
Monsieur Villemure.
En faveur.
Mr. Green.
I support.
Mr. Chair, yeas, yes. Sorry, yeas 5, nays 5.
Okay, Madam Chair, I vote in favor.
Perfect. Yeas 6, nays 5.
Okay, motion as amended carries. Thank you for that. And I still have two speakers on other issues. Monsieur Villemure, vous commencez, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Villemure, you can begin. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I suggest that the committee visit the NATO Center of Excellence as Mr. Glucksmann described in his presentation.
So,
Thank you. Is this a motion? Yes. Did you write out the motion for the committee in both official languages? Okay. Our clerk says that it is a short motion, so it's okay.
Motion? No? Do we have, Mr. Green, I see your hand.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest that it was an at-hand motion given the testimony that we had and therefore didn't require maybe some of the other stuff given that we have interpretation. Okay. I support it, and I think that particular to the instances around artificial intelligence and cyber warfare in particular are of deep interest of mine. And so I appreciate Mr. Villemure bringing this forward.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Green. Merci, Monsieur Villemure.
Thank you, Mr. Villemure. Mr. Couric?
The motion proposed by Mr. Villemure.
Thanks, Chair. And just to note that although certainly distribution in both official languages is important, being that it is timely, relevant, and a straightforward motion, and it gives then the clerk the ability to start putting together the details required for travel budget and whatnot. I think that it's entirely appropriate.
So, sitting on the liaison committee, we will try to, if it does pass, we'll try to propose that as quickly as possible. There will be a time lag because it does have to be approved. The justification rationale, I'll likely have to appear on behalf of the committee to justify this. By the way, Mr. Fergus, it was very easy to justify the trip to Gatineau. But this will take some time to prepare, just so that everybody's clear. But we'll make sure that we come back with a proposed budget that is fair and reasonable. So the motion is on the floor. I do need to either find unanimous consent or a vote on this. Is there unanimous consent on the motion proposed by Mr. Villemure? Seeing no objections, that motion passes. Merci, Mr. Villemure.
Thank you, Mr. Villemure.
Floor next.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. It was regarding your comment on previous motions. Given that the former interim ethics officer has resigned, I'm wondering if that motion is pertinent, or that study is pertinent at this point.
Well, this is the reason why I mentioned it. I need direction from the committee on this because the motion was passed, as you know. Our plan was to invite at least the two people that were named, the interim ethics commissioner and Minister LeBlanc. But I will have to receive direction from committee and receive consent or a vote on whether you still want to go down that route. So you provide me with some indication and direction. We'll see what the will of the committee is, and then we'll apply it.
I would propose, given our limited time for the additional studies that we want, and perhaps even the possibility of continuing the study on the motion of Mr. Villemure, that I would recommend that we that the events have passed us, and that we should not continue with that study, and I hope that there would be a consensus around the table to do so.
So you're proposing that. I would need a motion.
I would so move.
Okay, so the the motion is to not even start the study, correct?
Not even start.
Not start the study. Okay, I got a couple of hands up on that. Matt, Mr. Green, you were up first. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I would say that it's a bit of a moot point now. I think, we had a fulsome discussion around this in one of our previous meetings, and I'm happy to see that the interim made that decision in stepping down. It's unfortunate that it took this long and got this far, quite frankly, but it did happen. I am content with that and do not see the need to continue down that line with our very scarce resources and time at this committee.
Mr. Couric, you're next. Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Chair. I think that it's troubling that we have an attitude by certainly members of the Liberal government to, when a mistake is made, they adjust course after they've received significant criticism. Their misdeeds have been called out. There's a growing opposition to actions that they've taken. So then they rescind an order, they backtrack on a contract. The list is getting too long to articulate in the limited time we have, Mr. Chair. I find it concerning that the attitude then is that, oh, well, that's old news. It's no longer relevant, and therefore it does not meet the threshold of being discussed. My suggestion, therefore, Mr. Chair, is that the initial motion asked for 3 hours. I think we have, if my understanding of the calendar is correct, that instead of dismissing the study altogether, we can acknowledge that mistakes were made, and serious ones. The fact that we have a massive conflict of interest, the sister-in-law of a cabinet minister being appointed, the interim ethics commissioner is just, it's the stuff that I'm not even sure Hollywood would be that bold. So my suggestion, Mr. Chair, is that we, instead of 3 hours, it would be reasonable to ask for that hour that we have on Tuesday to try to get to the bottom of this so that members of this committee can ask questions on behalf of so many Canadians that are just flabbergasted at the lengths that this government would go to the actions they take that are eroding trust in our institutions. So that would be my submission, Mr. Chair. So certainly I won't be supporting ending the study. I would be happy to see it amended and adjusted because of the changing circumstances, but that would be certainly where I'm coming from.
Okay, so thank you, Mr. Kirk. And suggestions and proposals don't work as it relates to the standing orders. We need formal motions. Mr. Fergus has indicated that he has a motion to not continue with this study. Based on what I heard from you, Mr. Kirk, that and I'll remind the committee that we approved up to 3 meetings on this. So if you're proposing an amendment to Mr. Fergus's motion, I would ask you to formalize that now so that we can deal with discussion on your amendment. So what would your amendment be, Mr. Kirk? Okay, so I just, sorry, Damien, I just received clarifications from the clerk. Mr. Fergus's motion is in order to not continue with the study. There's nothing to amend on that. It's clear what his motion is, so we would either have to agree with it or not, and that would either require unanimous consent. If not, then a vote. So I just received that clarification from the clerk. So on Mr. Fergus's motion, Greg, you had one more thing to say, correct? Or are you done? Okay, so on Mr. Fergus's motion, I'll now ask for unanimous consent, and if there's no unanimous consent, then I will ask for a vote. So I see head shaking, Madam Clerk, if you want to, on Mr. Fergus's motion, and then depending on what happens on that motion, Damien, perhaps I'll go to you next, but go ahead, Madam Clerk, on Mr. Fergus's motion.
On Mr. Fergus' motion, Mr. Baines.
Yes.
Monsieur Fergus.
En faveur?
Ms. Hefner.
En faveur.
Ms. Koutrakis.
Oui.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Monsieur Lauzon.
Vous êtes en sautine.
Avec ton pouce, oui, non?
Oui, est-ce que ça fonctionne, là?
OK, non, ça commence.
OK, c'est bon.
Oui.
OK, merci.
C'est parfait. Mr. Davidson.
No.
Monsieur Gourde.
No.
Mr. Carrick.
I'm opposed.
Monsieur Villemur.
En faveur.
Mr. Green.
En faveur.
Yeas 7, nays 3.
Okay, so Mr. Fergus's motion carries, so there will be no further study on this issue, which will open up a little more time. Like I said to the committee earlier, we only have 14 meetings because we've lost 2. Is there any other committee business? No? Okay, thank you. I want to thank the analysts. Thank you to Madam Clerk and all the technicians for today's meeting. The meeting is adjourned.